25年前美国亲手送中国进的世贸组织，没想到这一步棋让他们今天悔到窒息。说这话的不是中国的评论员，而是一位美国商界分析人士，在公开论坛上用最冷静的语气说出了这个让美国人难以接受的事实。那么这帮西方精英当年是怎么算计的？他们觉得中国是共产主义国家，苏联已经垮了，中国早晚同样完蛋。他们又说中国不过靠廉价劳动力撑着，等工资涨起来自然被越南印度替代，所以他们大大方方的让中国加入了世界贸易组织，以为那是一盘稳赢的棋。话音未落，中国制造已悄然占领全球30%产能，华为突破了芯片封锁 DeepSeek， 更让矽谷的巨头们一夜之间哑口无言。这位分析人士说的直接遏制失败了，关税也救不了美国。让我们来看他到底说了什么。
The US has tried containment without success. It's now trying tariffs, which are also predicted to be unsuccessful. So what I'd like to do tonight is basically start by reviewing the first 15 years of the 21st century in terms of how China was viewed by the US then talk about the most recent 10 years where there was a fundamental change in the US's perception of China. And I'll do it by breaking the century into two different time periods. The first is the first 15 years, roughly 2000 to 2015. And during that period of time, the US frankly did not see China as a strategic threat. And there were a couple of reasons for that. One is it's communist China. And the US at that point in time thought there was very clear evidence that the only major global experiment in communism was the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union was a failure economically because the only real strength they had were the reserves in oil and gas. And their economy basically was unsuccessful. And then the second is the Soviet Union basically dissolved in 1989, so they were unable to retain direct control over the countries that made up the Soviet Union. So the U.S. started out with the idea that as a communist country, China is unlikely to be successful because Russia was not successful. The second reason that the U.S. did not take China seriously economically was that its economy was fueled by a huge supply of low-cost labor. So China was producing very cheap commodity products, but everybody understood that as China becomes wealthier, the wages and the costs will go up. Other developing countries will develop large pools of lower cost labor, and China will no longer be able to sustain itself simply by being the low cost producer. So the US was pretty comfortable when the issue of China entering WTO came along in the early 2000s and was actually supportive of China joining. And the underlying reason was it did not regard China as a threat, for those two reasons that I mentioned. But that changed very fundamentally when we got to 2015. One is China became much more significant in the manufacturing side. You know, we went through the period in the early 2000s of global, actually much earlier than that, but through globalization, an awful lot of US companies moved their supply chains to China. And so slowly but surely, China became the manufacturing engine of the world. And today it accounts for roughly 30 to 35% of all global manufacturing, more than double what the US is. And I still remember the first time I read about this when Huawei came out as the world leader in 5G. And a lot of US companies wanted to retain Huawei to take advantage of 5G. And that's when the US stepped in and said, we're not going to allow that to happen. And that was really the beginning of containment, as was practiced in the US. So the US, looking at the progress China was making in manufacturing, and evidence started coming in that other initiatives by China were also successful. So China became the global leader in renewable energy, in both wind and in solar. It became the global leader in EVs and batteries, having had literally no automobile industry that mattered 15 years ago, and now is the world leader. So the U.S. started to see enough evidence that China was a real strategic threat to the U.S. And so the U.S. put what it thought were very effective measures in place to prevent China from getting access. And then there were two surprises that changed everybody's point of view on the success of containment. The first is when Huawei came out with its new phone. And that phone was close to the iPhone in capability, sold for a price that was dramatically cheaper. And most importantly, it was made with a chip that China supposedly did not have the technology to develop. So the containment effort to prevent China from developing sophisticated semiconductor chips turned out not to hold up. So that was the first surprise. And then the most recent surprise was DeepSeek. DeepSeek was basically developed by a startup. It wasn't a government initiative at all. But DeepSeek generally demonstrated that it could match the performance of the high-end tech companies in the U.S. in AI, which were investing hundreds of billions of dollars in AI. So you then started to read an increasing number of articles in the U.S. that basically said the U.S. cannot contain China in terms of technology. And so Trump tried by, doubling down on some of the things that Biden did, but then he introduced tariffs as another weapon against China. And the tariffs had two broad objectives. One was to reduce trade balances between the U.S. and China, where obviously the U.S. was importing a lot more from China than they were exporting to China. But that's simply because China was a better, more effective manufacturing source. So the tariffs have gone in to basically stop the flow of imports from China to the U.S. But that process is turning out to be driving higher costs in the U.S. and driving inflation. So what we're seeing is that the first objective of tariffs is turning out to be very counterproductive because it's driving up prices in a significant way. And then the second objective of tariffs was to rebuild U.S. as a manufacturing center. So when you ask the basic questions of where is the talent going to come from to rebuild our manufacturing centers, where is the capital going to come from who's going to invest in underskilled labor and high-cost labor in the U.S.? And the answer is people aren't going to invest in that. If you step back and say the U.S. has now gone down a learning curve and understands that containing China and defeating them by tariffs is not going to be successful.
看完这场分析，我说实话，心里不是痛快，而是一种很复杂的感受。因为说这些话的人不是替中国说话的人，他只是用一个商业人的冷静眼光，告诉了世界一个让美国人非常难受的真相。我们先来说说为什么美国当年会这么严重的判断失误。在社会学上有一个概念叫路径依赖，意思是一个人、一个国家太容易用昨天的逻辑去判断明天。美国看苏联倒下了，就以为共产主义等于失败，这个公式可以套用在中国身上。美国看中国当年卖廉价商品，就以为中国永远只是低端工厂，永远没有技术突破的可能。这种思维方式就像看一个孩子小时候成绩差，就断定他这辈子成不了大事，结果人家闷头苦读，某一年考了全班第一，你才慌了神，开始嚷嚷说一定是作弊。这就是今天美国面对中国的态度，不是理性分析，是焦虑，是傲慢，是不甘心。再来说说关税这件事，这位分析人士把道理说得很清楚，关税有两个目的，一是缩减对华贸易逆差，二是重建美国制造业。但这两件事现在都在反噬美国，自己关税一上，美国老百姓生活成本直接往上冲，通货膨胀跟着来了。而所谓重建制造业，问题更根本，人才在哪里？资本在哪里？谁愿意在一个劳动力成本比中国高出数倍的地方建工厂？答案是没有人。我用一个比喻说，一家开了20年的老面馆，厨艺精湛， 生意火爆，突然有一天隔壁开了一家更好吃更便宜的新店，他的对策不是改进自己的手艺，而是在门口贴一张告示，禁止你们去那家吃。这不叫竞争，这叫心虚，而客人的脚自然知道往哪里走。数字是最诚实的，中国今天占全球制造业的 30% 到 35%， 是美国的2倍还多。新能源、电动车、电池样样都是全球领头羊。在美国全力封锁芯片的情况下，华为依然造出了让美国震惊的旗舰手机 DeepSeek， 只是一家创业公司，对标的却是那些烧了数千亿美元的矽谷巨头，而且不落下风。这些不是我们宣传，是美国自己的分析人士在自己的论坛上亲口说出来的。有人说中国的崛起是抢了别人的位置，但我想问，什么叫抢？我们用几代人的勤奋，用一个国家的意志，从一穷二白走到今天，这不叫抢，这叫挣。反倒是那些靠科技垄断、靠美元霸权收割了几十年的人，现在发现游戏规则在变，才开始嚷嚷说不公平。历史从来不问你公不公平，每一个曾经俯瞰天下的文明都以为自己的位置是永恒的，但历史的吊诡就在这里，让一个大国失去位置的，往往不是对手有多强，而是自己停止了创造美国今天的困境。不是中国造成的，是几十年的路径依赖、精英傲慢、制造业空心化积累下来的代价。历史的车轮从不因任何国家的意志而停转，它只认一件事，谁在真实的创造价值，而我们中国人从来都没有停下来过。